So if you are a faculty member at a university, you're trying to get tenure, you really have an incentive to try to get very strong study findings. This is how we get published, by kissing the right ass. I don't want to do this. That was just such a negative eye opener. And I think it was part of the reason why I didn't even pursue academia.
Let's talk about the field of behavioral science. You don't just know it, you have to translate between the science and product, right? And be able to tell what's real and what's bullshit. In the last few years, there's been quite a hubbub with Francesca, Gino, and Dan Ariely's work, right?
Yeah.
You're familiar with what I'm talking about?
Oh, yes.
So in a nutshell, for those not familiar, these are two of the most prominent behavioral scientists, and they were accused of, very credibly, falsifying data. And furthermore, many of the studies they published are not reproducible in independent labs. What are your honest thoughts about this as an insider? And how are you navigating this as you do this translation and make sure you're not applying junk science?
Yeah, there is so much to unpack there. So first of all, I've been really disappointed to see these things unfold. I have followed the Data Colada blog for years. They were kind of the whistleblower on the Francesca Gino case. They do a lot of going back over published studies, and if the original data sets are available, they'll actually go and try to reproduce analyses. And they were able to identify a lot of the issues that sort of led to the Gino case blowing up and getting national attention. And she actually had a lawsuit against them. I contributed to their defense fund. I think they're doing the Lord's work, and I'm glad that the suit against them was dismissed. I'm really grateful that there's people in the field who have the skills and the attention to do some of this policing, because it is really hard. We have a peer review process in behavioral science that is supposed to safeguard against this. And I've seen some changes to it in the last few years that I think are helping. So it's now encouraged and sometimes required that you provide your data to journals alongside with your journal manuscript, so that can be part of the evaluation process. There is an emphasis on pre-registering studies. So if folks are interested in behavioral nudging, some of the more famous nudging studies are lead authored by Katie Milkman out of Wharton, University of Pennsylvania. And she's awesome about pre-registering all of her stuff. And like her study materials are publicly available. Like that's best practice now, that you make it as easy as possible for people to see what you're doing, and you're registering your plans ahead of time so people know that you weren't doing something on the back end to take advantage of quirking the data or something like that. But it's still not entirely common practice. And even for folks like us, we do some academic publishing, but we are limited in how much we can disclose because, first of all, we're working with PHI. And so, like that vaccine study I mentioned, we were not able to provide that raw data set of vaccine replies to the journal because it's too easy to read the content and re-identify people. Like there are people who will include personal health information, talk about their health conditions. They might reference their home address or the medications they're taking. And so we felt that the right ethical balance there was to not share the data, even though that now means the transparency isn't maybe what we would like from the research side. So those steps are helping. They're not curing everything. I think some of the other issues are journals still favor publication of positive results. So we have what we call a file drawer problem. If you do a study and the results are not significant, or if they're negative, like your intervention, your test didn't work, it's really hard to get those published. And there's a couple journals that have cropped up that specialize in that, but they don't tend to be very highly regarded. So if you are a faculty member at a university, you're trying to get tenure, you're trying to get promotion, you're not incentivized to try to publish your null findings or publish in those types of journals. You really have an incentive to try to get very strong study findings, which I think is part of the problem. I'm actually finding that there's less of that pressure outside of the academic world. And it hasn't been really typical for folks like me to publish in peer review until more recently. But I think that the pressures are a little bit different there, where maybe we have a little bit more freedom to, I don't know, not succeed so much. But one of the things that really struck me, there's been a few papers that came out in the last few years where people are basically asking, do nudges even work? Because the effect sizes, when you look across studies, end up being really small. And I am not totally dissuaded by that for two reasons. So one is, I think there's a big case to be made for matching the nudge to the person and situation. So going back to personalization, a lot of times these studies are just done en masse. And of course, the average result isn't big. But if you look at the people that nudge really works for, like it really works for them. So I think that there's an intermediary there to explore. But the second piece is I actually think there's something good knowing that we have this reproducibility crisis about seeing some of these small effect sizes because it tells me that people are publishing on things maybe more honestly. They're not necessarily only putting out the papers that have these big blockbuster findings. You asked me how I deal with this as someone who uses this research. I will tell you, I do not cite certain people. You mentioned Ariely and Gino, and of course, those are two people that I make an effort not to cite. And if I see that a technique we want to try is coming from their research, we'll put extra scrutiny on it before we use it. And we will actually use things sometimes very knowingly that don't have an evidence base behind them if we have a good hypothesis that it might work. Like we're in the business of generating knowledge, not just using existing knowledge. But in general, I would shy away from using their work directly. And there's other folks on that list as well. And then I think as much as possible, trying to practice ethical research ourselves. And the last thing I'll mention with the peer review. So I try to participate in peer review. It's hard. I get so many requests to review papers. I couldn't possibly do all of them if I wanted to. But I think it's important to give back as someone who's publishing. And so I try to say yes, I don't know, 6 times a year, say. And I'm also a section editor for JMIR Formative Research. So I'm in charge of finding people to review some of these articles. And then I have to synthesize their feedback and make a decision about do people revise? Is it accepted? And I think a drawback to this is like I myself, I'm not a strong quantitative person. So when I review an article, I think I give very good feedback on the framing and the interpretation of the results and how do we apply this. But I am not capable of reproducing the statistical methods in most cases and saying, oh, these numbers don't seem right. And as a section editor, I can see that sometimes it's very hard to get the right diversity of viewpoint on a specific paper. So I think that's an issue with peer review. And I don't know what the solution is there, but it's my own experience doing this has kind of opened my eyes that any one paper might not have been really pressure tested from every angle.
Wow. It's a tricky needle to thread.
Totally. Well, so when I was an undergraduate at Harvard, there was a faculty member there who was caught up in academic misconduct. And one of her grad students actually blew the whistle on it. The grad student had wanted to do some initial additional analyses. I think wasn't able to get the raw data. This grad student figured it out and went to the university, and there was an investigation, and it turned out this person had in fact falsified quite a bit of data. She was let go. I really admire what that grad student did because they set their own career back by several years. Like there was a huge personal cost to that. And so I just think it's worth calling out that in these situations we know about, there were people who raised their hands and took a big risk. And I think they did a huge service to the field.
That's amazing. I love that you surfaced how much is driven by incentives because if you look at the overall system and the way that academic journals work and the way that tenure works, it makes complete sense. I got to tell you, one of the reasons I didn't become an academic after I got my PhD was my first job in a research lab in neuroscience grad school. I showed my boss a scatter plot of the data that we collected, and he pointed at a bunch of outliers and he said, throw those out. That's not what the funder wants to see.
Yeah.
And I had this
Yeah.
moment, maybe you've had that. I had this moment of like, me throw those out? But it was so eye-opening.
My moment was not about the data. I had an advisor, and before we submitted our manuscript, she pulled out the hard copy of the journal and she looked at the editorial board and she made an effort to cite as many of those people's papers as possible, regardless of whether they were really relevant. So our lit review was kind of all over the place. And I was just like, this is how we get published by kissing the right ass. Like, I don't want to do this. And so, yeah, that's actually not a thing I have paid attention to in my own publication. It's funny in saying this, I hadn't even thought to do that in my own publication in recent years. But in grad school, to me, that was just such a negative eye opener. And I think it was part of the reason why I didn't even pursue academia.
Amy, thank you so much. I
Well, thank
learned
you for
so
having
much.
me.